Doctrine of Absolute Morality 2024. Is there a moral absolute? Is there a line between good and evil? Can justice be put on a scientific, therefore, objective basis? Is morality quantifiable? Because if not, it would seem discussions on morality are nonsensical. There is no way for humans to divide anything in anything resembling an objective way, without it being quantifiable. In other words, only when the factor being discussed can be turned into two different strands, one numerically positive and the other numerically negative, can it be said the result is an absolute. Virtually every issue that confounds humanity hinges on the possibility there is a right answer to moral problems. The possibility there is a right answer implies the existence of a moral absolute. Moral absolutes hinge on the quantification of morality. Questions concerning the immorality of slavery and the objectionableness of racism, as well as demands for stronger gender rights, assume a right answer exists, and this right answer is beyond the chance of a violent mob. Even the concept of a right answer assumes right answers reside within an objective morality. Despite this, many of those demanding a moral response assume there are no moral absolutes. Those who express absolute moral rhetoric still say there is no fundamental difference between right and wrong. They may even claim, in a different context, that no one has a right to impose their moral vision on anyone else. Which smacks of hypocrisy. But the arguments against the existence of objective morality are put forward because liberals believe making moral arguments to support a moral position is morally wrong. Arguing that evil people go to hell is a moral argument that ought not be made, according to liberals. The existence of heaven and hell impose a moral absolute or moral standard on people who do not wish to live by the standard. Condemning people for immorality offends morality because having a moral standard is immoral, in the liberal worldview. For many liberals, the only moral standard is moral relativity. The one thing we cannot do, as moral human beings, liberals say, is assume how you live is fundamentally right. Liberals assert they do not object to people believing in God, so long as the belief is not touted as preferable to atheism. Morality is good, in other words, so long as it does not impose standards and principles on the believer. It is impossible to criticize another person's position without thinking one's position is the better one. Therefore, say liberals, being critical of another person is immoral. To condemn an argument on the grounds the position defended requires a moral judgment is in fact a moral argument. The person who argues there are no sound metaphysical arguments is making a metaphysical argument he thinks is sound. The person who claims only empirically validated statements are true disproves the claim he is making, because the claim made is not empirically validated, nor can it be empirically validated. One cannot test every statement empirically. If statements could be empirically tested, the results would be inconclusive, as the empirical method never produces absolute moral truths. The stalemate between those who espouse moral absolutes are possible and those who claim moral relativism is the only valid position, exists because neither side has maintained a consistent position. Moral relativists speak in the same terms as those who hold to moral absolutes. However, it is also true that those who claim they speak for moral absolutes talk as if moral relativism was a morally virtuous position. This confusion is due, at least in part, to confusing morality and ethics. They are not the same. If moral relativists make statements that are moral absolutes, those who claim to be moral absolutists will speak in terms that reflect a relativist position. There is either a right and wrong or there is moral relativism. These are mutually exclusive categories. Law cannot bridge the gap. The moral good cannot be adjusted according to need. Because moral absolutes are not acceptable in this world, and moral relativism lacks substance, the question is how to impose boundaries without resorting to moral absolutism? Of course, there is no answer because the question poses a paradox of incompatible terms. If relativism does not permit regulatory frameworks to be imposed and no one will tolerate a framework formed of moral absolutes, how do we control the masses? The answer has always been, from the dawn of time, by the use of force to instill fear. A fearful people is a peaceful people, is the reasoning behind the state. Governments use stronger and better armed men to control the actions of those who are less well armed and less organized. The state creates justice systems to regulate interactions. The written law gives subjects the impression that justice is objective. The rich and powerful are arrested for begging on the streets and for vagrancy, as readily as the homeless poor are. Regardless, in the final analysis, the law is nothing more than an opinion codified into a regulatory statement, backed up by the physical power of the state. But if moral truths are relative, even when codified into law, what ought the state to regulate? It is easy to say murder is wrong, but reality rarely permits such simple propositions to stand for long. There are too many exceptions and qualifications. Even slavery spans the gamut from chattel slavery to penal servitude to community service. Where do we draw the line, and what qualifications do we consider important, when dealing with real-world issues? Slavery is wrong in the form we think is wrong, but there is no line that is crossed when labor is turned into slavery. There is no single definition under the law for murder and no single model that defines slavery. We say things are morally wrong, but in reality, what matters to most of us is if the action is legally wrong, or not. If a criminal is killed to save an innocent person's life, we consider this an acceptable loss of life. It is also okay to lie to save a person from being made a victim. But then we also find it expedient for force people to work off a debt or obligation. There is also a tacit understanding that free labor is necessary to keep some institutions working. If we know these things to be true, the knowledge is based on a greater moral truth existing. The greater cannot be judged by the lesser, but the lesser truth is always gauged against the higher. A moral truth, higher than the legal system, or any application of the law exists, if the particular is to be qualified, by the general. The law we follow is not moral law. We know the actions of the Athenian nobles and Nazi bureaucrats were wrong, though legal. Both Greek and German, despite being civilized, failed to live up to a universal and absolute sense of how we ought to live. We do not absolve people of their moral failures, though everything they did was legal. That what they did was legal, in the face of almost universal moral opprobrium, only serves to bring the law into disrepute. The certainty we have concerning moral rights and wrong, permit us to judge the law. The law cannot judge moral principles. Some people think mankind is able to judge the actions of God. Liberals make many claims about the injustice, inhumanity and outright cruelty of God. It is not that they are right or wrong in their estimations, at issue is that liberals believe man has the ability to judge God. Regardless of whether we have the right, or not, we do not have the means to judge God. To think we can evaluate an absolute, is a monstrously huge assumption. Do we have sufficient moral virtue to judge another person, let alone God? The Bible tells us, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." We are told we are judged by the same measure meted out. This is a caution against judging others by our own metric. We are to judge others by the means of the church. What is the difference between saying a child ought not eat a lot of sweets and saying God is not fair to mankind? In both cases we think we are the embodiment of a moral code. We, as the moral measure of all things, transcends all persons and systems, and are above God, Himself. But we are not an absolute and our truth is not absolute. So how can we judge the absolute or do anything but voice one opinion that is one among many? How can God be subject to a moral truth that He embodies and indeed emanated from His person? But if we cannot logically criticize God, how do we judge the law and the state? Can we judge, or not? We are subject to the moral law, but there is no moral law higher than God. The only way moral truth can be greater than God, is if there is no God. If there is no God, there is no moral truth. If there is no moral truth, we are free to critique a particular narrative describing a particular God, because such a God is nothing more than a fabrication. If there is a God, morality cannot exceed the Creator of morality. God cannot exceed His own nature because He is inherently an absolute. Yet, remember, it is us that are constrained by the logic of the absolute, not God. The belief that moral absolutes are of a higher category of existence than God, confounds logic. Claiming there are absolutes higher than God, assumes moral absolutes have a source other than God. But then God would be derived from the moral absolute, rather than the other way around. Morality is a higher order of existence than God, if moral truths permit us to critique God. After all, if both man and God are subject to the moral law, man and God are on the same plane of existence, both being under the moral law. Moral absolutes cannot be divorced from absolutism. Absolutes must be granted existence before one can postulate the existence of a moral absolute. But the very acceptance of the existence of absolutes pushes us into the territory of metaphysics and God. Which reminds us again, that neither a moral relativist, nor a moral absolutist has taken a consistent position on the topic of moral truth. If you deny the existence of God because in your eyes, He is not moral, you are claiming there is a moral absolute all existence must be subject to. This is an absolutist and metaphysical position. If moral absolutes exist, law cannot have final authority. Legal systems have no moral value in a world of moral absolutes. It is not possible for law to be the supreme authority where moral absolutes critique the law, how it is applied and enforced. We have always been able to critique legal systems. BLM was an exercise in a morality based on skin hue. BLM was founded on a belief that black skin had moral value. Slavery was defeated, not because it was illegal, but because it was deemed immoral. However, when the law is open to the moral scrutiny of subjects, it has lost its regulatory authority. If we are governed purely by moral virtue, legal systems become passé and of no merit. A people who are governed by moral principles cannot at the same time subscribe to a legal system. The two modes of operation are incompatible. If morality exists and no one can claim it does not without contradicting themselves, legal systems must be shelved. Without morality there is no constancy or coherent thought. There must be a meta-narrative to which we all subscribe to or which is self-evident. Liberals turn moral relativity into a moral absolute when they claim there are no moral absolutes. Cultural relativity is the claim that all cultures are equally valid. As with most of what the left claims, this is a contradiction of terms. Cultural relativity requires a contradictory thesis. It is only those cultures that admit they have no special value, that are valid or have value. If you are in a culture that thinks their culture is just an option without any special merit, and others think they live in the best culture, your culture is the best and most perfect culture. The arguments of liberals are always incoherent, they always seem to contradict their premise. Indeed, the entire left is an oxymoron. The very relativism of the left and its claim that conservatism is bad, is tantamount to a testament to the value of conservatism. If everything is relative, and freedom the ultimate value, the left's critique of the right contravenes its own principles. The right may be exclusionary in its beliefs, but at least its arguments are coherent. Legalists claim it is immoral to murder but qualify the statement and the regulations outlawing it, with exceptions. The simple rule, murder is wrong, is qualified by listing degrees of severity and different forms of murder, such as 1 sup r equals slow st/sup and 2 sup r equals slow nd/sup degree. The law recognizes different extenuating circumstances, even to permitting cold-blooded murder, at least when done by an abused woman. The law, in its wisdom, has decreed, some abused women have no other avenue of escape, but murder. The problem the moral absolutists have, is that moral principles cannot be turned into lawful regulations. It is impossible to create a law that expresses a moral absolute. No rule encompasses every possible situation and circumstance. This problem of turning a moral absolute into legalese has become especially problematical when dealing with drugs. We know drugs are dangerous, but many have medical value. How do we prohibit the use of a drug for the wrong reasons but permitting it when needed? It seems that creating new versions of banned drugs is easier than making them illegal. Indeed, how does one make something that does not yet exist illegal? Can we outlaw crimes that have not yet happened and incarcerate the person before the crime has been committed? Does morality exist if it must be expressed in ethical terms? Is the doctrine of absolute morality nothing more than a desire to see well-written law? Or as it appears to be, are moral absolutes part of a meta-narrative, a higher intelligence which we can all utilize? The question asked here, to be clear, is if moral absolutes are similar to an ethical code or something on an entirely different plane of existence? Is a moral absolute a way of deferring to a higher wisdom, when there are alternative possibilities? We know murder is wrong, but there are situations in which the death of a person results and is justified. There are an unlimited number of conditions within which murder happens. Is context irrelevant when it comes to killing a person? Is it always an eye for an eye and a life for a life, or must life never be taken regardless of the circumstance? But if moral absolutes are not defined by rules, such as those given above, then a moral absolute is about principles. Moral truth is a meta-ethics, a rule or truth all truth and rules must subscribe to. Morality does not tell us lying is wrong or murder is wrong. Morality tells us that if an act conflicts with the meta-narrative, it is wrong. It is not the action or act that is wrong, it is its conflict with the moral rule. The moral absolute is not the stricture against murder, it is the principle which makes the act unacceptable. Morality gives rise to ethics, not the other way around. This is what so many do not seem to grasp. We will not arrive at morality by seeking to compact ethical codes. Morality is not inducted from an infinite number of actual laws. There is no meta-ethical statement that will morph into a moral principle. Morality is what is fundamental. Murder is morally wrong because of the nature of morality, not because there are innumerable statements concerning the harmfulness of killing others. Murder is wrong because it offends the moral law, not because it breaks innumerable ethical injunctions. This is the key to understanding morality. Ethical strictures do not solve moral problems, they are the problem. Ethical rules are invalid, unless there is an authority willing and able to enforce them. The key figure in any ethical system is the judiciary. Morality is centered on community and its mores. The moral individual is a fiction. He or she is moral because a moral community. We have already established that morality is not derived from the law or ethical codes. Thus, the individual is not the true moral guardian. This is why we are not to judge one another. The individual does not have the means to impose morality on others. To attempt such a thing only marks us as hypocrites. We are capable of imposing an ethical code on subjects, not a moral code. The moral code requires a community, not a person in a position of power. This is a problem for liberals who put a lot of faith in experts. But morality is not about expertise. It is about who owns what and who has a right to define the value of what is created. The church is the moral unit, not the individual or the state. This is because morality is tied to value, to the capital we create. The 1 sup r equals slow st/sup order principle or purpose of man is to be of use, to create value and be of value. Our purpose is to be capitalist in the generic definition of the word. To this we need to have faith. If we are ruled by fear, we will not produce value or be of much use. Capital has a corollary in civilization. To have faith is to create the church. The church manifested in faith is civilization. The church is a civil society governed by faith. Fear destroys value. Faith permits capital to be accumulated. The accumulation of capital is known as civilization. This is why we are told to have faith. If we do not have faith in the people of God, how can we claim we have faith in Christ? We are to create value, but to do this we must have faith in one another. Our faith or works of faith are manifested as civilization. We create value and the value we create can be tabulated. In contrast, those who are evil consume value. Acts of evil are without compensation. This suggests, evil persons are motivated by fear. They do not think investments will be protected nor rewarded, so they focus on taking what they can, while giving only what they must. The fearful build up treasures on earth. The fearful focus on creating disposable wealth. There is no long-term investment strategy. Those who have faith trust those with faith to provide what is needed. It is through the faithful that Jesus works. Jesus told us that those who feed the hungry, house the homeless and care for the sick, do it for Him. Acts of charity requires us to produce capital even in uncertain conditions. Those who do not have faith purchase insurance. If we had faith in our neighbors, we would not need insurance. Jesus works through the community, not individuals. We are the church. I am not the church. You are not the church. The greatest fear that has always plagued Christians is exposure to people who may betray them. We fear divesting ourselves of wealth, because we fear being betrayed. We do not trust the people of God. We fear the brethren may prove to be wolves. Some have given away what they had. This is admirable, but it does not fully reflect the words of Jesus. We are to do works of faith, with the wealth we have been given. These works are specific and produce capital. We are not to throw pearls before swine, and while surely this refers to the Word of God, it must also apply to what we do. A work of faith must be performed in accordance with the wisdom of God. We are to sell what we have and give the proceeds to the poor. This is not about making us poor but increasing the available capital. It makes sense to sell what we have to the church, to the people of God, as a community of believers in the service of God, than to enrich the world, which is what happens with private wealth. After all, we are to do good works and care for our own. To divest ourselves of our wealth by giving it to secularists, only reduces our value, the value of the church and the capital available with which to do good works. To sell to the church we need a community of believers. This is a paradox. We cannot sell to the church, if it does not exist. The church exists only when we have divested ourselves of our wealth. This is the sign of our faith. It is the ones who follow Christ, not the ones who mouth the words of Scripture, that have faith. The church is the community of believers. Believers sell what they have to church, as the representative of their collective faith. A church represents the believer in a corporate way. The church is the capital of the faithful. To permit faith to be expressed fully, believers must create a corporate entity created out of the capital of the faithful. This is what the Bible refers to as a church. The church is the face the faithful present to the world. The church is a legal entity in the eyes of the world and takes the form of a trust or a not-for-profit charitable corporation. It is through this body that the church becomes a light to the world. Christians are the church and represent the capital of the church. Each member represents a common or voting share. Each member is a unit of capital. All commercial property owned by the members under the law are divested in faith. All commercial property is sold to the church, in exchange for shares issued by the church, backed by the assets owned by the church. Shares backed by assets are called preferred shares and represent the equity of the organization, or its working capital. Property with a commercial value of $30,000 becomes 30,000 units of equity. Each unit of equity is issued as a preferred share. These shares serve as a unit of account held by the member. Preferred shares have no value, they merely tell members the state of their account. Each member has an account on the local church. The account is credited with a balance equal to the value of the donation made upon entry. Units of account are denominated in preferred share units or prefers. Prefers is a contraction of preferred shares, symbolized by zapataya, and serve as the accounting unit used by the a priorian church. Cash cards or paper currency can be issued by the church backed by the equity held by the local branch. Prefers function as a medium of exchange and store of value for the church. If a property crime is committed, the church adjudicates the case. This is a process that determines the cost created by the offense. It is morally necessary to create value and immoral to destroy value. Justice is the activity of restoring value back to the plaintiff and adjusting the account of the guilty. Penalties can be quantified and adjudicated in and by the church. A plaintiff accuses the defendant of creating an unwarranted cost. The court determines if a cost has been created illicitly without compensation. If the defendant is found guilty, the court also imposes a means of restitution on the defendant. There is a clear line of demarcation between good and evil and between profit and loss. Capital is earned or destroyed. Creating value is an absolute good. Capital destruction is wrong and the wrong needs to be corrected. Because values can and are quantified, the exercise of justice can be put on a scientific, therefore quantifiable, basis.